Hello everyone, this is Mitchellmander here, and welcome to the first review of the new Pokemon series. I am just going to simply refer to it as Pokemon New Series for right now until we get a proper name for this series, or at least a dub name for it. But I'm just going to refer to it as Pokemon New Series. And today we are going to be talking about the very first episode of this series, which is episode 1, simply titled Pikachu is Born. It is a pretty decent episode. It's mainly a backstory for Pikachu and Go and Kohara, and a little bit of Ash. But Ash is mainly a side character in this episode for pretty much the majority of this episode, as his screen time is very limited here. Another thing to note is that this episode predominantly takes place in the past, specifically 4 years prior to the beginning of the series, which is interesting to say the least. And it is kind of interesting to see this backstory for Pikachu along with Go and Kohara. And yeah. Anyways, before I actually get into the actual episode, if you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe, as I will be covering this series in the future. So this episode starts off kind of similar to how the first episode in the original series started out, which is in Pallet Town with Dotrio basically crowing at the morning sun, and Ash waking up and running up to his mother. And this is a 6-year-old Ash, and he's very hyperactive, and he's wanting to go to Professor Oak's camp so he can learn about Pokemon. Not to be confused with the summer camp that he went to with Serena back in X and Y, but it's kind of the same thing, kind of. And he's like all super excited about it and wants to go to this camp. And he's acting like a 6-year-old would, so yeah, it's hyperactive Ash. Yeah. Anywho, the episode kind of splits off from here, because then we go to, this is several weeks before the actual camp starts, in which it goes into detail about how there's a bunch of Pokemon living in this area, including a Pichu who's all by itself, which is our boy Pikachu as a Pichu. And it is wandering around, and it ends up falling off a cliff, and it ends up in basically a Kangaskhan tribe, and ends up befriending a Kangaskhan and its baby, and ends up living with it for several weeks. And these scenes are very heartwarming and touching, I gotta say. I like how they emphasize how small Pichu is compared to Kangaskhan, and the baby Kangaskhan is way bigger than Pichu. And you can tell that Pichu was probably just born just not too long before this. So it's very interesting to see kind of just the interactions here. And it ends up living with the Kangaskhan tribe for what it seems to be several weeks. We then cut to a couple weeks later, in which is the day of the camp, in which of course Ash sleeps. So sleeps in, he oversleeps, and he destroys his alarm clock like he did in the first episode. I like the callback here. And he freaks out and runs out to go try to be at the camp on time, but unfortunately he misses his opportunity, and they end up taking off without him. And this is where we see a young Go and Kohara, who are 6 years old at the time. And basically this camp is for Professor Oak to basically teach the children about Pokemon, how they work, and just a little bit more about them. And it's funny because Go himself is actually a really smart kid, and he actually knows a lot about Pokemon himself, and he ends up naming up a bunch of Pokemon and basically what they can do and essentially what their Pokedex entries are, which is actually pretty cool and neat. And it shows that this Go's a very knowledgeable little kid, and Kohara is getting a little annoyed at him because he's basically taking all the spotlight, and it's to the point where he's not going to make any friends, but he doesn't care. But he ends up seeing a Mew. He actually ends up him and Kohara end up getting away from Professor Oak and the others, and they end up running into a Mew, who is actually battling a Nidoking, and it ends up basically destroying it. Basically, any attack that Nidoking throws at Mew, it basically throws it right back at it, basically copying its moves, and ends up destroying it, which perks Go's interest, and he ends up running after it. And it morphs into different Pokemon, like Magmar, for example. And it's interesting because each time he morphs into another Pokemon, Go actually calls out the Pokemon's name. showing more so that, yeah, he's a very knowledgeable kid. But everything kind of ties in here because like we go back to the Pichu or the Kangaskhan family, and the Pichu and the Kangaskhan are playing, and it's time, to eat, and they get eggs from a Chansey. But the baby Kangaskhan kind of runs off because it ends up seeing Mew and climbs up a cliff and tries to get close to Mew, but ends up falling off the cliff. And Go and Kahara are also here to witness this, and they're all freaking out. And the Kangaskhan mother and Pichu see this happen, and they're all freaking out because the baby is about ready to plunge to its death. But Mew saves it at the last second. And, yeah, close call there. It was interesting to see that all three parties here kind of, came together to see this incident. It was nice seeing everything here. I thought it was all kind of well done and well paced, honestly. So, Professor Oak, who had been frantically searching for Go and Kahara, eventually finds them and kind of talks with them and basically tells Go and Kahara that the Pokemon they most likely encountered was actually a Mew, which Go desperately wants to turn 10 so that he can actually go and meet this Pokemon and catch it for himself. And I think this is actually pretty interesting myself, because I was wondering how they were going to handle Go's dream of wanting to eventually find Mew again. I wasn't really sure when the summaries came out a couple weeks back, but I thought it was pretty well done here because it basically saw on screen and kind of got to witness firsthand what Mew was like. And as a little kid, it probably perked his interest big time. So, this is actually pretty nice. I thought it was well done. Now, I liked how the scene kind of ends here. Like, it shows like how, the Kangaskhan baby, is safely reunited with the Kangaskhan mother and Pichu. It shows Go and Kahara walking back. And then it has Ash, who missed out on all of this, is just, crying at his bed because he messed up. He's disappointed in himself. And of course, he always likes to sleep in all the time. I just like to call back to the first episode, but I thought that was funny. But the next scene is basically a little while later, in which Pichu and the baby Kangaskhan have grown a bit. And it's to the point where the Kangaskhan mother is actually kind of over-encumbered, and it shows that it's actually getting exhausting running back to the cave. And Pichu attempts to run on its own, but Kangaskhan puts him back in the pouch. And it doesn't matter that it's tired. It treats Pichu as its own. But for Pichu, it realizes that it's finally time to separate itself from the Kangaskhan family. But it appreciates all that the Kangaskhan and the Kangaskhan baby have done for him. And before it leaves, it looks back, and as a sign of gratitude and happiness, it evolves into Pikachu, which I thought was actually really well done. And it was nice to see that this is how Pikachu this is basically an interesting origin story for Pikachu. Now, for the rest of the episode, it basically cuts back to not present day, but to the very first episode of the series, where Pikachu ends up in, Oak's lab eventually, and ends up meeting Ash. And I like how it's a recreation of the first episode in which Pikachu met Ash, but it's from Pikachu's perspective, and it ends up shocking Ash, and it's annoyed at him. And yeah, it was really nice. And that's pretty much where the episode ends. Now, the opening scene, which I presume is going to be the opening for the series, is actually really nice. I actually really like it. It reminds me a lot of Alola and Your Adventure, just because of how, especially with the dancing scenes, it kind of reminds me of the first opening for Sun and Moon. But it also reminds me a lot of Your Adventure as well, with the fluid animation. But yeah, anyways, the episode kind of ends off basically, in the present time, in which Kahara is basically walking back with her friends and mentions that, Go doesn't really go to school. And it shows that he's, wants to go on an adventure. He wants to meet Mew. And this is the start of his adventure. So yeah, an interesting way to end off the episode, which segues into the next episode, which is essentially the proper first episode of this season. So, overall, I thought this was a pretty decent episode. I mean, when it comes to first episodes, it's probably not my favorite. I know this may be controversial, but I enjoyed the first episode of Sun and Moon a little bit more than this one, though, and also X and Y's first episode. But this was still a pretty decent first episode. An interesting backstory for Pikachu, Go, and Kohara. And yeah, I thought it was overall a pretty decent episode, so I'm going to give this episode a 7 out of 10. So guys, what'd you think of this episode? Did you like it? Did you like the heartwarming scenes between the Pichu, or baby Pichu, and the mother Kangaskhan and baby Kangaskhan? What do you think of Go? What do you think of Kohara? What do you think of Ash back in the day? Leave your thoughts in the comment section down below, and be sure to like and subscribe, and I will talk to you all later. Have a good day, everyone.